Jumping into Unit 7, right away we're talking about emotional contagion, and we have a definition from dictionary.com. It's described as a noun, the tendency to feel and express emotions similar to and influenced by those of others, also the phenomenon of one person's negative thoughts or anxiety affecting another's mood. We then followed this up with a TED Talk from Jessica Garza from 2020 titled How to Avoid Catching Prickly Emotions from Other People. This TED Talk basically just focused on the importance of avoiding picking up negative emotions from other people and focusing on the positive. It could be hard to do this a lot of times, we have a tendency to kind of go where the river takes us, go where other people go, but it's important to recognize, when other people are kind of in their low energy or kind of crabby emotional states, and just to focus on ourselves in those moments and to not always kind of fall into that negativity trap. After that, I read a very brief article by Christian Jarrett from 2023 titled Here's What Makes Your Emotions More Infectious to Others. And in this article, they just talked about how we have a natural tendency to kind of mimic the emotions that we see around us. We do this because a lot of times it's easier to kind of understand other people's emotions if we feel them ourselves. And a lot of times, as a result of this mirroring, it's pretty easy for us to kind of be affected by others and to affect others ourselves with our negative emotions. Next, we did kind of a bigger dive into a look at how Facebook took advantage of emotional contagions. And in this, we read an article by Kramer from 2014 titled Experimental Evidence of Massive Scale Emotional Contagion Through Social Networks. And basically, this reading was kind of a summary of this was a time back when Facebook kind of showed different content on its platforms to users to kind of see what kind of material or content they would engage with on the site. So to some of their viewers, and this was without any direct informing, but basically they showed some of their users more positive content and they showed others more negative content. And then they watched to see what kind of content they engaged with after that. So what they were liking and what videos they were watching and what they were posting. And then there were a couple more readings that came after Kramer's article that also talked about the legal justification for this action, but also just kind of the ethical and moral concerns around it, considering they didn't really do a lot to actually gain consent from people or inform people that it was happening. So then for my discussion post for this first assignment, I briefly defined emotional contagion as I previously did. And then secondly, I gave a brief example of an emotional contagion that is not internet-based and that was not talked about in the TED Talk. And I said that laughter seemed to me like something that could kind of be an emotional contagion. A lot of times when you see someone laughing, especially a friend or someone it's kind of easy to jump in. It makes you want to do the same. But because it's more kind of sound-based, it's not really something you can translate through text very easily. So I just thought that was a good example of something that doesn't always translate. And then later in my discussion post, I talked a little more about the Kramer article, and I talked about how researchers manipulated the posts that people saw in their feeds, and how positive emotional content from friends was either shown more or less to users, and that this had a very subtle effect. It did have an effect, but it was very small, with those who saw more positive content being more likely to make posts that contained positive wording. Then I had to answer the question of whether or not I found the study to be ethical, and I said that I don't think it was as bad as some people make it out to be, because as we saw, the effects, the changes weren't that different, and because there hasn't been too much research on this in the past, we didn't know necessarily that showing more negative content to people would necessarily harm them in the first place. And it's also legally defensible, which doesn't inherently mean that it's ethical, obviously, but I think it makes it harder to argue that what they did was wrong. That being said, I do think the fact that they didn't do much to gain consent and that they altered feeds without consent does seem kind of inappropriate. I thought it was sort of a strange thing to do, and I don't think it was very morally correct. I understand why they did it, but I just don't think it was the right thing to do. And then finally, for this post, we had to speculate about maybe a time when we might have ever consciously felt kind of emotional contagion ourselves on the internet. And I talked about how there have been times when I feel a certain way because I witness said emotion on the internet. I feel like I've definitely experienced this before, especially when it comes to excitement about something like a new TV show or a video game. Like sometimes you see an announcement and you just kind of feel like happy about it or something, but then once you see other people like kind of talking about it and pointing out a bunch of details and getting all hyped up, it's easier to feel more excited yourself, I would say. But after that, I was done with my assignment 1 post. Starting off with assignment number 2, we have a little just Tumblr post from Kurds and Wayface, 2017, and they talk about how they think that a fundamental part of online friendships that people generally fail to understand is that it can be very comforting to have very easy access to someone to talk to. You know, someone who's right there in your pocket and who just is readily accessible and who will listen to you and who you can talk to kind of readily. Because, I mean, we all get busy sometimes and we all have our own lives, and sometimes those kind of in person relationships can be hard to call on when you feel like you need them. But, you know, having someone who you could just text from wherever at any time is, you know, a different kind of comforting. And then following this, there was a whole massive list of about 20, yeah, it looks like 20 different research articles, each which describes an empirical investigation of online emotional support. And they talk about everything. They talk about support groups for people living with AIDS. They talk about people with depression. They talk about people who are trying to lose weight. It's a whole different set of things. It's actually pretty beautiful to see all these different ways that different people on the internet are coming together to support each other and help work through their problems and talk about the things that they feel upset about. I decided to read the 9th article by Kim and Gillum from 2014 titled Gender Differences Among Young Adult Cancer Patients, a Study of Blogs. I thought it would be interesting to read this article just because I had never previously thought about how a person's like gender might affect their coping abilities with an illness, let alone how like technology or blogging would play into this. It just seems like such kind of an interesting web of like interactions that I just thought it would be an interesting read, and I was really curious to learn more about the findings of the study. In the study, the researchers sought to compare how young men and women who had been diagnosed with cancer decided to use online blogs to write about their experiences. They wanted to see who would and would not write and what kind of material would be written about. The purpose of the study was to see if online anonymous blogs changed how willing people were to express their emotions in these spaces, because generally we do see sort of a stigma against men in particular, as they're typically held as like less emotional and more like stoic and kind of less willing to talk about their feelings. They specifically, kind of wanted to consider how men would react in these scenarios with their like anonymous kind of standing. In the end of the study, they found that young men and women communicated online at very similar rates to each other, these cancer patients, and they spoke about different things. They talked about their experience with cancer, their emotions, etc. at similar rates. So they discussed like a whole kind of smattering of topics each, but they both both genders were likely to kind of talk about their problems at like similar levels. This was an interesting finding as it would suggest that men are more likely to discuss what they're feeling when they could do it in a space that they feel is kind of safe and secure and less judgmental compared to when they're in like an offline physical space where it's harder or maybe an impossible to kind of keep that level of anonymous behavior. That was everything for assignment 2 though, and it was time to move into assignment 3, which starts with a pretty solid opener. Line A says, "As promised, we now come to the point in our course where we talk about cats and the internet," which I think is a pretty cool, interesting, like an opening. I think that's kind of fun. First, we learned about the pre-internet kind of history of the public's use of cats for emotional engagement. We did this by reading through the public domain reviews summary of the 1911 book Kittens and Cats, A First Reader. This reading kind of references back to like a book. It's basically just a picture book, and I would recommend looking this up because it's kind of hard to get the whole appeal of it without really looking at it yourself. But basically, it's a set of cats who are all wearing these different costumes or who are kind of posed up in these different like kind of settings, and they're either wearing like different hats that kind of make them appear like different characters. It kind of like personifies a lot of them. Like there's one where there's a cat just kind of sitting there in a dress, and there's a caption at the bottom that says, "It is my party." And there's another one where there's a cat wearing like kind of the set of chainmail and like a little paper crown, and there's a caption that says, "I am the queen." Like it's all just kind of fun, cute stuff like that. It's an interesting read, and it's from 1911, which is crazy to think about because it's like, in these last 115 something years, like how much have we really changed if we're still taking pictures of cats and laughing at them and whatnot. Next, we did a little reading from Know Your Meme about the hang in there baby kind of pictures of cats. This is a series of posters that were pretty popular back in the 70s, and they kind of pop up every now and then today, but they're not as popular as they once were. But basically, it's a picture of a cat kind of like hanging from like a string or like some sort of like place, and it's unsupported, and it's just kind of like it's you literally just using its arms to hang there. And then there's a caption that says something along the lines of like, "Oh, hang in there, like keep pushing, like keep going on, like you got this." Just as kind of this like motivational poster, and it's just kind of fun, cute, like random like humor. And then we did a little more learning about some kind of famous internet personalities of cats. We learned about Keyboard Cat, Grumpy Cat, Lolcats, and like we looked at the I Can Has Cheeseburger photos, like just some really classic stuff. We don't know exactly why people are so fascinated with these cats, but we went through a series of about 7 articles where different kind of hypotheses were proposed and different explanations were given as to why maybe people sort of focus on these cats so much. I decided to write about a theory from Elizabeth Fish's article. She says that cats are so prevalent on the internet because they're the perfect canvas for human projection, which is kind of an interesting idea. This idea that we can project ourselves onto like a cat, like a four-legged, like kind of small, hairy, like animal, because it's not a human and there's nothing really like a human, but it's just interesting the idea that we could kind of give them like a personality, even though they're not people. I would say that I largely agree with this hypothesis. I think there are a few animals that show like as much as like attitude or act in like a human manner like cats do, and I think this is a big part of what makes them appealing to watch and engage with. They seem to get upset and crabby just like humans. They can be playful and interesting just like people, and they even can like show signs of like being hungry and tired pretty well. Even though they don't talk like people, they can be pretty vocal when they like meow or like make sounds. Um, and it's just like the way that they're so kind of upfront and like out loud with their like almost their feelings or their wants is just like a very endearing trait, and it does kind of come off as human in a sense. And then going on to discuss whether or not this theory is actually testable, I would say I don't really think it is. I didn't really think that a lot of the theories that were presented here would be, just because they are kind of more like out there ideas, I guess you could say. For example, like in this theory, they do talk about how like cats being the perfect canvases for human projection. Perfect is like a big word, that's hard to prove that anything scientifically is perfect. Um, and even just going beyond the language, like saying that like a cat is the best option is hard because how would you compare it to every other animal? Like maybe donkeys or like dogs or whoever are better, more comparable substitutes, but we don't really have a good way to prove that without comparing them directly one to one with all these animals, which would be very difficult. I also just think it's hard to kind of talk about like how we project things onto animals. I'm sure you could set up a study where you have participants look at a series of images of animals who seem to be like maybe expressing behaviors, and then asking participants to kind of say like, like which of these pictures maybe seems more human. But I don't know, it would be kind of an awkward study. I mean, I'm sure it could be done, but it would just be interesting, I think. That was everything I had for assignment number 3, though. And moving on to assignment number 4, right away we're going to go back to the discussion board section for assignment number 2 and look at everything that everyone else said. First, we're just going to start by reading all the posts that were written by the other people in my section. I first went to a post that was made by Taylor. She had also talked about the gender differences among young adults article by Kim and Gillum, as I did, so that's why I decided to follow up with her. Um, she says that she actually chose this article because she knows someone who was diagnosed with cancer. So I don't personally have that background, but I just thought that was interesting to kind of tie it in like that because, obviously that's a very kind of sincere and difficult issue to tackle. So I could understand where she was coming from by wanting to kind of dive into that deeper. But basically, in my comment on her post, I just made sure to talk about how I thought that she did a good job of kind of keeping her explanation of the study succinct. It was a little confusing to talk about because there were the different layers of people with cancer and then kind of separating them based on gender and then talking about like their blogging and like what kind of communications that they do. But she did a very good job of like keeping it all succinct and talking about it. So I thought that was interesting. And then commenting on her post just more generally, I just thought that it was interesting the findings that young men and women like communicate at similar rates. I know the whole point of the study was to kind of combat the stigma that men face and see like what it's like for them to communicate when maybe they kind of have some more like anonymity behind them, and just sort of opening up and communicating more. But to actually see it happen, like just so simply, as soon as they were, moved to an online space was really interesting. And I just thought that that was really, really an impressive finding because I was not expecting to see that. And then I decided to comment on Nicole's post. She chose to read Fioravanti et al.'s 2023 article titled Longitudinal Effects of Exposure to Body Positive, Fitspiration, and Neutral Content on Instagram, an Experience Sampling Study. She said that she chose this article because as a woman she felt that she struggled a lot with body image in high school and throughout college, and that she always felt like she was comparing herself to others online, and she could tell that it was kind of having a negative effect on herself. She talks about how the researchers studied the impact of daily exposures to body positive images, inspirational images, and neutral images on Instagram. Researchers examined how those images over a certain period of time influence young women's mood, body satisfaction, and tendency to engage in comparing. Ultimately, they found that participants exposed to positive content showed the highest growth in positive mindsets and higher growth in body satisfaction. Fitspiration was found to be associated with a negative mood and comparing oneself to others. I obviously did not choose to read this article because I talked about my other one with the cancer patients, but I still found it to be very interesting. And I thought that Nicole's kind of analysis of it all was also very interesting. I believe that having a positive body image is a very important aspect of like accepting yourself and just having that kind of peace of mind of loving yourself and, being good with your mental health. And it's not something that we should kind of just ignore or push off. I had a question about this, the final paragraph that Nicole posted, because she mentioned something called Fitspiration, and that's not a term that I've really heard of before. It seems to be kind of like a portmanteau of like a fitness inspiration deal. So my guess would be that it's a matter of like kind of posting about exercising more so, but Nicole's comment talks about how it kind of creates a negative effect, which was interesting to me because if it is about, being fit, then I wouldn't expect that to come off as negative. So I was just kind of curious about that. I was wondering what exactly that meant then and kind of what I guess the negative effect of that was. And then I also just wanted to comment on the reasoning that Nicole used for her commenting, as I just thought that it was, a very good reason to pick this article because it does talk about like a kind of health that affects everyone. If we think about body image, it's important that we all sort of are able to look at ourselves and love what we see. So I just thought that it was a pretty cool thing to be considerate of and to read about. And, it's sometimes complicated to think about where those feelings come from and why we have them and what they mean and what we can do, especially to solve them. So I just thought that it was cool that Nicole felt, compelled to read about this article because I thought, it's definitely something worth talking about. But otherwise, after looking at those two posts from my classmates, I was done with assignment number 4. Moving on to assignment number 5, today we had another group chat meet. And then prior to this meet, we started by watching a TED Talk from a Harvard psychologist called Dan Gilbert from 2004 called The Surprising Science of Happiness. And then we also watched a TED Talk from Sean Anker, 2011, called The Happy Secret to Better Work. The main focus of both of these talks was to highlight the fact that our perception is largely what can influence our happiness. For example, within the Gilbert video, we talked about how the main points of the article were kind of about synthetic and natural happiness and how these types of happiness are not necessarily better to one another. So, for example, natural happiness is the kind of happiness that we feel just whenever something generally good happens to us. Like maybe you find $5 on the street. Whereas synthetic happiness is kind of how we are able to manipulate our perception of an event to kind of convince ourselves that it was a good thing. It's really about kind of finding a feeling of fulfillment or satisfaction in whatever result we do end up with, even if it's maybe not what we initially wanted. Within the second video, our group also discussed the idea that achieving goals doesn't end up making us happy at the end of the day. And this is oftentimes because when we do accomplish things, we kind of have a tendency to move the goalpost. So, for example, you might get like a 92 on an exam, and that's really cool, and that's, exactly what you wanted in that class. But now suddenly your goal is to get like a 95 on the next one. And then maybe you don't make that. Maybe you got like a 93 or 94. Now that's still better than where you started, but because it doesn't match this kind of new goal that you set for yourself, you might feel like you didn't succeed, even though the reality is that maybe you did improve. I don't know, it's just really a matter of kind of being more objective maybe about looking at where you started and where you ended up and realizing that you are better off, even if it doesn't necessarily feel like it. Before this chat, we were also supposed to find 2 YouTube videos or websites that brought us happiness, 2 reasons we're grateful to be in this class, 2 reasons we're grateful to be in this specific chat group, and 2 good things that have happened to us in the past 24 hours. This was kind of a fun opportunity to talk about, like things that we liked and sharing different, like little bits of like entertainment that kind of make us happy. I shared actually the same things that I shared at the beginning of this course, so that would be the music video for Weezer's song Island in the Sun, and then I also shared that link to Bandle, which is the clip, or no, it's a website where it's kind of like Wordle, where every day you play a game of like you have to guess a song, and like you get 6 chances to guess it, and every time you get a chance wrong, it gives you like a little bit of instrumentation from the song to give you like a better chance of guessing it. And then my 2 group mates, Lucas and Angelica, also shared videos about golf players, and then Lucas also shared another video. It's about like this cooking video, but all like the utensils and ingredients and like the stuff in the kitchen is like super super tiny. Like it's crazy. I've never actually seen a video like this, but it's all just like super miniature and it's kind of fun to watch. And then Angelica shared a video. I think we've seen it before in this class, but it was a video of this little kid like crying because he thinks like his cat is getting taken away, and he makes like this face that's just like really like funny, honestly. But yeah, it was just like super wholesome to kind of see this stuff and talk about things we like. And then we talked about how like we're grateful to be in this class because it's useful to like learn this different stuff about the internet because it's so applicable to so much of what we do. And just how like having an online class is nice because it affords us like more flexibility and to like kind of work within our schedule, and it just kind of really works so nicely. And then we also talked about how we're kind of grateful, just to be in this group together because, we all get along and it feels like we contribute equally, and it's just nice to kind of be able to meet up and get this work done together and just collaborate, with other people. Even if it's not directly face to face, but it's still kind of the same idea of, sitting down and working together that matters. And then we talked about some cool things that have happened to us in the past 24 hours. I talked about how I finished writing a paper and I was happy about that. And then Angelica talked about how she got a new plant. And then she sent a little picture of kind of what it looks like. And it's like this cute little pink plant, and it's all nice. And then Lucas talked about how he found out about some plans that he had for the weekend with some buddies of his that he was looking forward to. So altogether, we had some pretty cool stuff happen to us. And yeah, I was glad that we got a chance to kind of sit down and talk about it together. It was fun. But that was the end of the group chat otherwise. So we nominated ourselves for our positions. And then that was actually our last time meeting together as a group. So unfortunately, we didn't have to plan a next time to meet because it was over, which was kind of sad, but it was nice getting to work together while we did. But it was time to move on. With that being said, that was the end of assignment 5. Going into our Unit 7 course review, we were asked to explain what emotional contagion is and how emotional contagion might spread through the internet. And I answered by saying that emotional contagion is the concept that anytime we possess an emotion, the people around us might contract it and begin to feel it themselves. For example, when we are happy, we're smiling and laughing, which means that it's going to be more likely that other people around us will also be happy, compared to maybe a more neutral state. The internet easily allows for emotions to be spread as we communicate with each other using videos, emojis, different kinds of text. such as by capitalizing letters or bolding or italicizing, and etc. And then while physical body language doesn't really carry over, our feelings still can, and our kind of thoughts and intentions. And then we also had to identify 4 of the hypotheses that were discussed in class as to why there are so many like kind of representations of cats on the internet, and why internet users get so much pleasure from these. And I said that even before the internet's cats ruled the memes, that cats outnumber dogs, cats are easy to personify, and kitties are cute. That's what I talked about. Those are all true, by the way. I firmly believe all those. Very true. And then as for progress on the term project, I kept up my journaling, and I actually made my first sort of podcast episode for Unit 7. And then I posted that in the medium that I was going to be sharing it. Originally, that was going to be on Podbean, but I actually kind of had some difficulties uploading content there. There was limits to how much I could put up in a certain amount of time, so I switched over to YouTube because there are no restrictions there. But I took my Unit 7 and I put it up. And then I made just a short 200-word summary where I talk about the project that I've chosen, which medium I want to work in, and actually how much work that I've completed so far. But once I was done with that, I took those 3 different parts and I just uploaded them all together to the Unit 7 Assignment 6. I should say 2 parts, really. It was the it was the course review sheet, and then it was also the term project document that had a screenshot of my episode 7 podcast that I just put on there. So then it was those 2 parts that I uploaded. But that was it then for Unit 7.